Hi, welcome to the Neurodiversity India Summit today, and thank you for taking the time to listen to my talk. So just to start off with, who am I? A little bit about me. My name is Amy Adams, formerly Amy Cram, and I am an autistic woman, late diagnosed last year at age 24. I've attained a Bachelor of Psychological Science with first class honours from the University of Queensland in Australia. And alongside my studies, I worked as a researcher for the School of Psychology and undertook support work with autistic girls and women. And after my degree, and this is all pre-diagnosis, I was drawn towards further work in the autism space. I kind of just felt like I clicked really well with other autistic people, and I felt like very sort of drawn towards that. And I started a position as a program development officer and autism advisor at Empower Autism, and that was based in Brisbane. And in these roles, I developed and facilitated lots of different services and resources designed to support the independence and well-being of autistic people and their parents and carers. But I did sort of over time notice a lot of gaps in the services that are tailored to the unique experiences of autistic girls and women. And I also around this time received my autism diagnosis. So I'm motivated to fill some of these gaps, and with this new sort of understanding and passion in this space following my diagnosis, I started Finding Autism, which is a space where I offer mostly one-on-one peer mentoring work with other autistic girls and women. I run a monthly online discussion group where we talk about all things to do with autistic identity. I conduct independent research, and I create content and also do some collaborations here and there. And down the track, I'm looking into offering some counselling services. So I am married with two adorable dogs. You'll see a really nice photo there from my wedding, which was a few months ago, and that's my partner Mac. And yeah, he brings me a lot of happiness and support, so I'm really lucky to have him. And I've got ongoing interests in psychology, philosophy and music since a young age, and recent interests in minimalism and environmental sustainability. So now that I've got that out of the way, here's what you can expect from the talk today. So my aim is to raise awareness of autistic experiences, particularly in relation to mental health and well-being, because that's the area that I'm sort of working in. And I'm going to describe some of my research that I've done in this space, which is with autistic girls and women. So some of the key findings will be discussed in relation to late diagnosis, masking, our experiences with mental health professionals, acceptance and belonging, autism-specific strategies for managing stress and emotions, and I'll finish off with autistic interests. Okay, so a little bit about these surveys that I have conducted. So earlier this year, I created and distributed two online surveys. The first survey had a total of 144 participants take part, which were exclusively autistic women and non-binary people. And the second survey had 200 participants, again, autistic women and non-binary people. Survey one was like a little bit more general, looking into several different topics about autistic experience and how we see ourselves and our lives. And then survey two was more specifically on mental health experiences. So a lot of the people who took part were derived from my LinkedIn network. So I've got quite a large network of LinkedIn contacts. And then some of the participants were also found through autism Facebook groups, which are based in Australia. So it was a mixture of sort of responses where you select the questions, questions where you select the responses, like agree, disagree, strongly disagree, that kind of stuff. And then also written responses. So a lot of the data that I got was qualitative in that form of short answer and written responses. And what I did with that data, it was 121 pages all up of qualitative data and responses. What I did was I went through and conducted a thematic analysis to make meaning of that data. So I identified recurring themes through an inductive process, which means that I didn't have any key themes to start with. I didn't sort of cherry pick the data to fit with key themes that I had in my mind. Instead, I let the data speak for itself, and I just noted key themes as they arose. And once I identified a recurring theme, I would then count up the frequency of participant statements that fit with that theme. Yeah, cool. So before I go into the results, there are some caveats to keep in mind with this data. So one thing is that a lot of autistic men, like when I've sort of presented the data before, they say that they resonate with the findings as well. So I by no means want to exclude autistic boys or men. I just had that focus on women and non-binary people because of the gaps in that space. So yeah, a lot of autistic men might resonate with the findings as well. It is definitely a non-representative sample, which means at the end of the day that the findings from these surveys cannot and do not represent the experiences of all autistic women or non-binary people. I'm just drawing conclusions about the select few people who did participate. Okay. So the first topic is to do with late diagnosis. And just some background, more boys than girls are diagnosed with autism, and one potential reason for this is that the model that we have for classic autism diagnosis has really turned out to be a male model. It doesn't mean that girls or women don't ever fit into that model, just that we might display our autistic traits in a different way or not be as well captured by that model. And yeah, often this can lead to misdiagnosis of autistic girls and women, or us being diagnosed much later in our lives. So in my first survey, I found that 85% of the women and non-binary people were diagnosed as autistic in their adulthood, 10% in their teens, and only 5% in childhood. So what are the implications of late diagnosis? So receiving an autism diagnosis in adulthood, as opposed to childhood, can lead to worsened mental health symptoms and a lower quality of life, according to a recent study. And another study found that those diagnosed as an adult are 3 times more likely than those diagnosed in childhood to report experiencing different psychiatric conditions. And I guess the question arises of why. And a separate study found that growing up and going through life as an undiagnosed autistic person is described as feeling isolating and alienating. And on the other hand, receiving a diagnosis can be a really positive step towards an appreciation of our unique needs, so what we need in our lives to thrive, and provides us with a better sense of self and identity. And also there's this concept that having a diagnosis does provide a scientific explanation for our differences, and that can reduce feelings of shame and feelings that we're struggling so much due to a personal failing. It's an alternative explanation for why we might have struggled through our lives, and with that a lot of good and a lot of self-understanding and self-compassion can come with receiving that diagnosis. Okay, so I'll go straight into the next topic, which is camouflaging. So a little bit of background again to start with. What is camouflaging? So based on research from Laura Hull et al. In 2018, the following 3 subcategories of camouflaging were defined. So the first one being compensation, which are strategies to actively compensate for difficulties that we might be experiencing in social situations. So for example, copying people's body language and facial expressions, or learning social cues from movies and books. And so I definitely engage in this strategy a lot, or did a lot before my diagnosis. I'm trying to, not camouflage as much these days. But yeah, I definitely watch people and imitate their body language and facial expressions to make sure that I'm kind of fitting in with the social situation that I'm in. And the second subcategory is masking, which is a strategy that's used to hide autistic characteristics or portray a non-autistic persona. So for example, adjusting our face and body to appear confident and or relaxed, or forcing eye contact. Yep, I definitely do that as well in my life, definitely forcing eye contact, and it is painful to do that. So yeah. And number 3 is assimilation. So strategies used to try and fit in with others in social situations. So putting on an act, avoiding or forcing interaction with others. So for my survey, the first one, I looked into camouflaging a little bit, and I found that 63% of the 144 autistic women and non-binary people that participated reported that they attempt to hide or minimize their traits to appear less autistic most of the time or always, which just sort of speaks for itself, I guess. And the behaviors that a lot of these individuals were showing, like I sort of conducted a thematic analysis of short answer responses, and I yielded the following key themes in order of frequency about what camouflaging behaviors that these individuals engage in. So number 1 is suppressing, soothing, repetitive behaviors or fidgeting. And number 2 is adapting gestures or body movements, so monitoring our facial expressions, posture, forcing, nodding, even though it doesn't feel natural to us. Number 3, keeping quiet or suppressing urges to talk about our own interests. 4 is studying and mimicking non-autistic behaviors. 5 is forcing eye contact. 6, engaging in small talk despite it feeling extremely forced or unnatural. 7, remaining in overwhelming situations and hiding our emotions until we're alone, in which case we might then break down. And 8, actively adapting our way of speaking, such as volume and tone. So the next question that comes up is, are these behaviors adaptive? And in short, a lot of research, including my own survey, suggests that these behaviors are not adaptive for us. So when asked how it feels to camouflage during and afterwards, all but 4 of the 144 respondents mentioned exclusively negative impacts. So only 4 respondents mentioned any sort of positive impact from camouflaging. The rest of it was completely negative. And these impacts included feeling more anxious and overwhelmed as a result, exhaustion, depressed feelings, feelings of emptiness and numbness, feeling lost, increased feelings of loneliness, feeling more disconnected from others, and physical impacts such as migraines or sickness afterwards. And this is one of the quotes from a respondent in the survey. So she said that masking makes me feel like a shell of myself. I get exhausted during and after. Often I get pushed to my sensory and social limits, and when I get home or in a more private place, then I cry and struggle mentally. I also dissociate, so feel like I'm connected, like I'm disconnected and floating, etc. quite often. Masking makes me feel like I'm only worth anything if I'm not myself. So there were so many quotes which were very similar to this, like really harrowing experiences of feeling disconnected from themselves and other people, just feeling really exhausted and pushed to their limits as a result of camouflaging in social settings. So you can sort of see that there's a direct link there to negative mental health outcomes. So the question then arises after this is, why would we camouflage our autism if it's something that is so detrimental to us? And one potential reason is that many of us feel dismissed, judged, misunderstood, invalidated, disrespected, and or discriminated against based on being different or mentioning that we're autistic. And this might be enough motivation for us to feel like we have to camouflage and hide our true selves. And as you can see, 40% of respondents in survey 1 felt that way. And a separate question, I asked respondents, what's the hardest thing about being autistic for you? Because I was curious about what that would be. Would it be a particular trait, some of our sensory sensitivities? What is the hardest thing about being autistic? But I actually found that by far the top theme was negative treatment from other people. So nothing about our traits and how we have our internal experiences, but it was more about how other people are treating us because we're autistic. And this included references to other people applying their biases to us and negative biases about what autism is, not feeling validated or understood from others, having been judged and ostracized, and having autistic identity dismissed as well is quite common for these women. So comments like, you don't look or behave autistic, you can't be autistic because you're nothing like this other person I know who is actually autistic, they actually struggle, you don't. So it feels very dismissive. Yeah, so you can imagine how those things might impact on someone's mental health, their sense of self and that kind of thing. And that might lead into that feeling that we don't have any other choice but to camouflage in social settings if we want to feel like we're safe in those environments and like we're kind of able to get by. So it's a big issue. So are mental health professionals any better? So I'm kind of taking a little bit of a leap now into the second survey, a segue, I guess, and thinking about, well, we get a lot of this judgment, ostracization, negative treatment from general people in our lives, and often we'll go to mental health professionals to cope with some of the adverse effects of this, but also just generally to cope with some things that we're struggling with and with mental health. And are these settings useful for us? Are mental health professionals able to provide us with that acceptance and that safe space? So 156 of 200 survey respondents in survey 2 sought help from mental health professionals since being diagnosed or identifying as autistic. And when asked if these professionals had a good understanding of autism in women, a stark 40% of respondents said no, 40% said sometimes, and only 20% said yes. So we can see that there are still issues even within these mental health settings in terms of understanding what autism is like in women. And some of the impacts of this can be quite significant. So I also asked the question of what has been unhelpful during mental health sessions, and 4 key themes emerged from the survey responses. And these were, again, the professional having a poor understanding of autistic women, feeling dismissed, invalidated or gaslighted by the mental health professional, use of mainstream strategies that fail to account for neurodivergence, and the professional not using an autism-friendly communication style in their approach to support. Okay, and then I sort of asked, the opposite question, what has been helpful during mental health sessions for those that have seen professionals since being diagnosed, and 2 key themes emerged. The first one being speaking with a professional that is autistic themselves, has lived experience with autism, so for example, a loved one or partner is autistic, or is otherwise highly specialised in the experiences of autistic women. And number 2 was feeling heard and having autistic identity or experiences validated by the professional. So this kind of leads me into this concept of acceptance and belonging. So with mental health professionals, but also with people in our lives in general, being heard, accepted, and feeling a sense of belonging is so important. It's a massive part of being a human being and achieving wellness, autistic or not. So devastatingly, in survey 1, 49% of the autistic women and non-binary people surveyed said that they rarely or never feel a sense of belonging amongst other people in their lives. And this is despite the vast majority, 72%, feeling that it's really important to feel heard, accepted, and that we belong. And the reason that I sort of put that in there, because you might think, well, of course, you know, it's important, but there is like this concept that autistic people are just happy to be alone, and they're just happy to sort of be left alone and happy to be isolated. It might be the case in some instances, but by far and large, we're human beings too, and human beings are wired for connection. I know my personal experience is that I feel less need to be around others and less need for maintaining friendships than what many people who aren't autistic feel, but it is still really important fundamentally for me to have at least some source of acceptance and belonging. I'm lucky that I get that from my husband and from a few close friends, and for me that's more than enough. And then other autistic people might be extremely socially motivated and feel like that they want a lot of friends and a lot of acceptance and belonging in their lives. We're all different, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's important for us as well to have acceptance and belonging, and it's something that it's really hard for us to find. So it's clear that, you know, I've gone through a lot of mental health support options might not always be helpful. A lot of times we might feel very alone and alienated in our experiences, and some of us are unable to find the acceptance and belonging that we're searching for. So if we're kind of in this stage where we're stressed and sort of alone in our experiences, what are some strategies that we can put in place to help manage? And this is something that, again, was in survey 2. So 200 autistic women and non-binary people described their strategies for managing stress. And 7 key themes emerged from the short answer responses. Sorry, there's a typo there. Just ignore that. So the 7 key themes in order of frequency was alone time. So removing ourselves from other people and reducing sensory input, movement, exercising, pacing, dancing, some form of physical activity, meditative or mindfulness practices, repetition. This came in many different forms, but examples are like engaging in simple repetitive rituals each day, or stimming behaviours, which is short for self-stimulatory behaviour, which is something that's like repetitive. It could be hair twirling, it could be tapping, it could be like a fidget toy, that kind of thing. Nature, so spending time outdoors or looking out onto nature, engaging in our hobbies and interests, and animals, so spending time with pets or watching animals in their natural environment. So I thought this was really cool, this data, because these are autism-specific strategies for managing stress. It's something that, you know, some of those like meditation and nature, and maybe hobbies to some extent, are things that most people would use to manage their stress, but definitely some of the autism-specific themes are that alone time, the need for repetition, really valuing time with animals over people, and maybe a stronger urge or need to engage in our hobbies. And again, I asked a very similar question instead for how do you manage sad emotions, and the top themes, some overlap as you'll see, but the top themes in order of frequency were getting support from a partner or close friend, alone time, emotion release, so like letting the emotions out somehow, hobbies again, animals, resting, so napping, sleeping or otherwise resting, and listening to music. So a little bit of a different kind of pattern of responses, but definitely some overlap. But again, something that came up which sort of surprised me a little bit was that, you know, a third of the respondents said that to manage sad emotions, they do reach out to other people for affection, to vent or to seek supportive advice, or they have a partner who kind of comes to them and supports them during that time. So I think that sort of positive human interaction is really important for us, even as autistic people, but also having that balanced with adequate alone time and time to engage in the things that we're passionate about. So going a little bit more into autistic interests, this is sort of going back to survey 1, where I looked into autistic interests. So it's quite well known that deep devotion or passion for hobbies and interests is often a large part of being autistic. A lot of people use the term, special interests. And I did sort of find that 74% of the surveyed autistic women and non-binary people in survey 1 do have these strong interests that last for years. But also 61% have strong interests that change frequently. So I think there is a concept that to be autistic, you have to have this deep special interest that's present from childhood. It needs to be really intense. It doesn't always look that way. Particularly for women, it can be a little bit different. And a lot of our interests might appear to be a lot more mainstream and therefore not really identified by, for example, professionals doing a diagnosis. They might not identify us as having a special interest or meeting that diagnostic criteria because our interests tend to be a bit more mainstream than our male counterparts. And so the most cited interest was artistic endeavors. So this included stuff like photography, drawing, painting, or other creative hobbies. The next cited one was intellectual hobbies like learning, problem solving, researching, and then there was also reading and writing. And then other common themes included music, nature, fitness, gaming, animals, human psychology, advocacy or social welfare, science and technology. So a lot of diversity in the interests of these women that were surveyed. And many of the autistic women, I wanted to understand the function of our interests. So when I asked, why are your interests enjoyable for you, essentially trying to get from them, what do they get out of their interests? What do they enjoy about these activities? I got some really rich qualitative data on that, and some of the key themes was this sense of calmness and relaxation, or some other kind of therapeutic benefit to those activities. The pursuits were also really commonly described as providing a way to escape and also to express ourselves authentically, particularly when we don't have any other outlet where we can be our authentic selves. So I can really see the importance of autistic interests when it comes to mental health as a protective factor for our well-being. I definitely find in my own personal experience, the more that I'm actively engaging with my interests, hobbies and passions, most of which are independent things like reading philosophy, learning about psychology, playing, creating music, the more I engage in those activities, the better I feel. I do find it helps my mental health when I'm going through a period where I'm struggling. It is something that it feels therapeutic to me to be alone and engage in those sort of solitary hobbies and interests. And a lot of autistic girls and women that I work with in my mentoring work, a lot of them sort of feel the same way about their interests. Okay, so some take-home messages from the chat today is that better diagnostic measures and support are needed for all autistic people to improve mental health outcomes, and particularly girls and women. And it's really important to figure out how we can clue in parents, educators, diagnosticians, and mental health clinicians about how autistic females might present differently with our traits and experiences. Camouflaging absolutely should be considered in this diagnostic process, but also by friends and family, people around us considering camouflaging and stuff and how that relates to autistic identity and how it might actually be hiding our authentic selves. I went through a lot of negative impacts of camouflaging and the links to sort of poor mental health. So I think for me, the take-home message from that is the importance of encouraging a positive sense of autistic identity. And that can be done by connecting with other neurodivergent or autistic girls and women who have that strong sense of autistic identity and sort of learning from them, learning ways to embrace our unique needs and wants in life. There are lots of sort of books and advocacy resources out there in this space. So I think learning a little bit more about autistic identity and sort of encouraging a positive sense of autistic being and authenticity is something that is really important. And hopefully with that, we'll feel less need to be camouflaging in our day-to-day lives. We can maybe seek out like-minded people where we can actually be our true selves and not have to experience some of those negative impacts of camouflaging. And then just in general, more education and awareness about autism is absolutely critical for both the public and also mental health professionals who work in this space, educators, pretty much everyone. And I also went through, some silver linings are like the importance of acceptance and belonging. So if we can achieve that can be so amazing and powerful in our lives. I've definitely experienced my life change almost overnight when I found my now husband, because he immediately accepted and embraced me. And that was something I hadn't really felt before, not to the same extent. And having that feeling of belonging, acceptance and connection with him has just been amazing for me, and my mental health has never been better. So I'm quite lucky in that respect. But it's something that not all of us will find, and I definitely didn't find it. I went 24 years of life feeling completely alone and alienated in my experiences and suffering deeply as a result. So, if other people are in that space, what are some strategies that they can put in place that are autism specific that help them to manage their stress and manage low emotions? And I kind of reviewed a few of those strategies. And also the importance of embracing autistic interests as a potentially protective factor for mental health. So here are some references. I did reference a few external studies which can be found there. And if you're interested in seeing the full findings of my research, you can go to www.findingautism.com.au. And that's all. Yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you found the talk interesting, and have a nice day.